Hi, welcome to On Becoming a Healer. This episode focuses on a story from the New York Times about the firing of a legendary professor of organic chemistry, Maitland Jones, at NYU. For many of us, we know that organic chemistry is a classic weed-out class in the process of getting into medical school. He was fired this autumn because 82 of his 350 students from last term protested that his class was too hard. So the real question we're going to be asking is whether the field of medicine and the patients we aim to help have been well served in terms of how we pick medical students. And with me today, of course, is my co-host, Saul Weiner. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
So let's talk about the story a little bit. We're going to set the background. Organic chemistry is one of those classes many of us take, in fact, are usually required to take in order to apply for medical school. If you don't do well, very often you don't go on to apply for medical school, in fact. Maitland Jones is 84 years old and had taught first at Princeton and then at NYU on a contract basis. He had written a 1,300-page textbook of organic chemistry, which has seen 5 editions. He's a legendary professor. And he taught a tough class. In fact, in one of the reviews we saw online, somebody wrote, "Orgo," referring to organic chemistry, "is a nightmare." And Maitland, who wrote the Orgo textbook, an internationally renowned experimental chemist and an avid jazz lover, can actually make it a nightmare as well. But it's really just tough love. Maitland will push you to understand organic chemistry radically, and you will come out of his course having the best tools to use to become a chemist. But there was a letter of protest written to administration, and administration took one step to try to allow students to retroactively withdraw from his class from last year. And finally, when he was about to begin teaching in the autumn of 2022, he was terminated. And that triggered a controversy. Are we doing the right things? Are we cushioning the blow too much for would-be medical students and allowing people who are not particularly competent to approach medical school? That's the kind of dispute that arose as a result of his firing. So that's the skeleton outline of the story. And I wanted to ask you, Saul, if you think I've covered the key elements of why this got our interest.
Yeah, I think you have.
So, what stands out here in part is the legend of organic chemistry in terms of how we have to get through it and biochemistry and chemistry and physics on the way to becoming doctors. And just out of curiosity, Saul, did you do okay in your organic chemistry class?
Well, I got a B. I actually took it over the summer between, I think, my sophomore and junior year, and I didn't do it at the institution where I was in college. I actually went somewhere else, and I thought I would do better there, and I also didn't want it to ruin my whole year. So I had a really tough summer, and I just lived Orgo. But yeah, I got a B.
You had to dedicate yourself to it fully, though, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it was very painful for me, but I did slightly better. I'll just lord that over you for a moment. I got 2 A- and an A in the quarter system. But be that as it may, for many students, this is the thing that ends their aspirations to entering medical school. And that story, that reality is what's triggered quite a bit of dispute. And I think the real first question I want to ask about this is, have we been picking people to enter medicine the right way or the wrong way all along? Do we have evidence on that matter, or do you have a very strong opinion on the matter?
First, I just want to emphasize how important I think a question that is. And, when the article came out in the New York Times, and there were actually 2 follow-up pieces on it, it really got a lot of attention. There were thousands of comments. When I was looking through those comments, I was struck that was a question that people weren't asking. In fact, most of the comments were about, what a bunch of wussies these pre-meds are, and they were just very supportive of the professor and how, the administration is just sold out to these tuition-paying students. And just an example. So first of all, I think the comment that received the most responses read, "I, for one, hope I don't receive medical care from a doctor who couldn't pass a tough undergraduate organic chemistry course." That received 6,799 thumbs ups, basically, at the time. Another one was, "Doing poorly in a class should be a reason not to go into certain fields. A student who can't hack organic chemistry does not belong in medical school." That got 6,170, basically thumbs up. I'll read one more. I think you'll get the gist. "Why is the default reaction of the university now to ease the course curriculum instead of failing our students that do not need to be studying in a particular program? If you can't focus enough to handle the coursework, that's a sign that it isn't the field for you." That got 4,791 comments, and so on and so forth. But I think the larger question, of course, is, do you need organic chemistry to be a doctor? And then, of course, that in itself leads to, I think, a broader question, which is, what do you need to learn to be a doctor? And I think that's really the question that we need to be asking ourselves. And the first one is so important because, as you said, Orgo has become like a gatekeeper course for students who want to become physicians. And so many students end up basically throwing in the towel because of this course. And so the question we have to be asking ourselves is that the right thing? I mean, this course, you have to make a darn good case for a class that's going to screen out a lot of people for a field. There has to be a lot of evidence that it's doing the right thing.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to make a case here. I'll stipulate that, yes, when I see somebody in primary care and measure their blood pressure and discuss which medicine to switch, I am not actually thinking about organic chemical reactions in that moment. I acknowledge that. However, organic chemistry is one of those classes that requires extraordinary amounts of discipline and a significant degree of sacrifice. And in order to get through it, because it involves both scientific content and a great deal of memorization, you have to be willing to suffer. So there's sacrifice, there's suffering, there's some cognitive complexity there, there's memorization, which is a key skill, as it turns out, in getting through medical school. And, ultimately, medicine itself is a tough field. We can't 100% take care of patients by checking things up on our phones in the office. So maybe we need people who, broadly speaking, have been willing to gut it out and just throw themselves into this fully and manage to pass it. What's wrong with that argument, or is that a good argument?
So first, I want to make the point that this debate has been going on for a long time. There was a nice piece about this way back in 2009 by Joseph Albert, who's the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Medicine. And he actually summarized this debate, which goes back to the 1930s, 1920s even. And he writes, there's no evidence that physics or calculus is needed to prepare for the basic sciences. Some believe that organic chemistry is important to understand biochemistry. However, it has been suggested that the relevant portions of organic chemistry could be incorporated into a biochemistry course. And then he quotes earlier pieces written by himself and Robert Coles, a famous psychiatrist, who note that success in organic chemistry depends on, quote, unquestioning meticulous memorization. These are certainly not the qualities that we look for in the competent physician. The pre-med requirements have been under attack by medical educators for at least 80 years, yet they remain intact. And I think one of the challenges here is proving a negative, right? I think that it's not hard to make a case that something should be in the medical school curriculum. It's much harder to make the case that it shouldn't be. And I think this is something that we've seen over and over again. People talk about how going to medical school is like drinking from a fire hose. There's this enormous amount of stuff. And quite honestly, it begins at the pre-med phase, which is why we're having this conversation. And everyone will make the case for their little niche. The organic chemists will talk about how this is incredibly essential. And you're going to hear the same thing from the calculus professor, and you're going to hear the same thing from the physics professor. And it's very hard to come back and say, oh, no, you don't need this, because they're always going to be able to come back with some example where a particular formula in organic chemistry or a particular physics equation was used in nuclear medicine or in some rare metabolic disease in the case of organic chemistry. And I think that there has to be a good faith conversation about what physicians really need. And keep in mind, of course, that physicians need to be continuous learners. They have to be able to find information and synthesize it throughout their life and throughout their careers. So, of course, there will be a physician who needs to know a fair amount of organic chemistry, and there's probably going to be a physician who needs to know a fair amount of calculus. That doesn't mean that all physicians have to acquire an enormous amount of knowledge in these areas just to get into medical school. And so I think the question becomes, how do we have a good faith conversation about what we're really looking for when we select physicians, because this is a gatekeeper class, and then after that, what we want them to learn and how we want to train them going forward?
Much of the commentary that was posted on the New York Times website and a lot of the conversations essentially came down to, I don't want my future doctor to be a wimp who couldn't hack it. And some version of modern students are too fragile. And we'll come back to that discussion in a moment. But I did read a kind of defense of organic chemistry from a journalist who had aspirations to go into medicine and ultimately did not. So let me just read you a line from Pamela Gwynn Kripke, who wrote on October 25th on InsideHigherEd.com about her own failure. She wrote, I failed organic chemistry twice, first at Brown, then at Yale. They are distinguished defeats, I'm proud to say. And then she says there's something in the vast array of reaction mechanisms that a certain kind of brain can differentiate and apply. And it's that kind of brain that suits the practice of medicine and therefore serves all of us. If I break my tibia, I don't think that in order to treat me, my orthopedic surgeon would need to know which compounds would form Grignard reagents when treated with magnesium in diethyl ether. But I would want to know that his brain could figure it out. We go to doctors because we can't repair our own tibiae or operate on our own small intestines or do well in organic chemistry. So she offers a kind of ringing defense here for this skill set. Are you sort of stuck? I mean, do you think it's persuasive?
Not at all. And I think I'm glad you read it because I think it really captures the mystique associated with entering the tribe of medicine. The notion that your orthopedic surgeon should be someone who could figure out organic chemistry and that is going to be important when you choose an orthopedist is completely without evidence and, in my opinion, without logic. I think that comment, that account by her really captures what I saw in these thousands of comments was this mystique about physicians, that they somehow should have this ability to work their way through this arcane stuff and memorize and demonstrate that they know it. The fact that I made it through organic chemistry, does that make me a better physician? I think one of the things we have to stop and do right here is reflect on how we as a profession are doing in patient care. Where are we performing well and where are we performing poorly? I think there's a lot of evidence that physicians are falling short in a whole range of ways. There are a whole range of quality problems in healthcare. We know physicians make all kinds of medical errors. We know that they interact with patients in ways that are unpleasant. We recently did an episode on medical gaslighting. We know that physicians are often distracted by the electronic medical record. We know that physicians make a range of diagnostic errors. I'm not hearing about physicians who are dropping the ball because they didn't know organic chemistry.
No, but the counterfactual we don't have, right? So yes, doctors make errors. Those are profiled. I don't really know if our errors are higher than in some country where they don't require organic chemistry. We often are jerks. I suspect that is, I can't tell if being forced to learn organic chemistry makes us into jerks. But getting through organic chemistry, we're supposed to gut it out. We're supposed to be tough, disciplined people who suck it up and suffer in order to get all the way to medical school. And now imagine a world in which the people who become your doctors didn't have to continuously postpone gratification and didn't have to suffer and didn't have to suck it up. Wouldn't they be worse doctors?
So 2 points. First of all, I'm not convinced that we need to test whether doctors can suffer and suck it up to determine whether they're going to become good physicians. But if we decide that that is an important part of the selection process, why not at least make them suffer over something they actually need to know?
Oh, okay, that's brilliant. And let me just mention, you are this former senior associate dean for medical education at a 4-campus medical school system, right?
In fact, I was, yes.
I think it's worth mentioning because you're not just I'm playing the role of the conservative here. But the one thing I've never done is run the medical education system for a medical school, whereas you have. And I think our audience deserves to know that. But okay, so back to this. We could make people suffer and suck it up. If we really think that suffering, suck it up, and discipline are very important, and I'm currently thinking they might really be, maybe we could do it over something that's actually germane to the field in a more intimate way. Is that a point you're trying to make here?
Yes. And, interestingly, when I was the education dean, I got immersed in the whole challenge of thinking about curricula and what is it that future physicians need to know. And people may be interested in hearing that the organization that accredits medical schools, the LCME, actually doesn't say what it is that medical students need to know. They have very general guidelines about what medical school faculty need to think about when they're designing a curriculum, but they don't actually specify what it is that medical students need to learn. There are a set of standards and curricular content, which is standard 7. It says, quote, the faculty of a medical school ensure that the medical curriculum provides content of sufficient breadth and depth to prepare medical students for entry into any residency program and for the subsequent contemporary practice of medicine. Now, that single sentence, that's their guidance. And everything else is pretty much in the hands of the medical school faculty. So I think that gives you an idea that it's pretty much open field. Now, I just want to start by saying I don't actually disagree with that. I think that an accrediting organization shouldn't be specifying what medical students need to learn, because that's going to be constantly changing. And there's a tradition in university education that the faculty always own the curriculum. So I'm not questioning the approach of the accrediting organization, but I think it's important to realize that the faculty have an enormous responsibility. So if you're the organic chemistry professor and you're in charge of training people who are going to be future physicians, or if they're already in medical school and you're the biochemistry professor, you have an enormous responsibility to think about how to spend that time well. What are you going to ask those students to do to demonstrate that they're ready to move on to the next level? And how are you going to commit yourself to helping them be successful? Which, by the way, is the opposite of weeding students out.
So weed out culture says, look, we only want the best to make it in. And we don't want half-assed people who can't get shit done to enter into our medical schools because they're going to be half-assed doctors who can't get shit done. And you're saying you don't want high standards? Is that what you're saying?
Interestingly, many people think that's what's implied.
Yes.
When you focus on student success.
I know you well enough. I'm pulling your chain, but I want you to explain this point because people are going to be asking it.
Absolutely. In fact, I would say just the opposite. I would say that an ideal curriculum focuses on helping students achieve mastery. There's this concept in sort of modern curricular science that we should be reverse engineering our curricula, starting with a decision about what we want our students to know and to be able to do when they finish our course. And then we should work backwards to figure out how we're going to get our students there. That is actually the highest standard because the focus is on getting all of your students to a level of mastery. Now, if they're not getting there on time, then they may need more time. And if they can't get there at all, then they may not be able to successfully complete the course. But there's absolute clarity from the get-go about what it is that your students are going to have to achieve to be successful. And I think that idea of teaching to mastery and reverse engineering your curriculum is what we're aiming for here, but it sets a very high level of responsibility to the professor to define clearly what it is that those students are going to need to master. And that has to be justified. It has to be clear that these are the skills that those students are going to need to advance to the next level to achieve their professional goals. When you read that review about Maitland giving students the best tools to become chemists, that's not an endorsement in my opinion. They're not there to become chemists.
Let me just ask, the logic that you've laid out, is there a way in which it would help medical school admissions offices and test designers, would it help them think about whether OChem versus anything else is particularly important deciding who to allow into medical school in the first place?
I think we do need to have a process for selecting medical students, but it needs to be a process that is thoughtfully customized around an account of what a future physician should look like, of the characteristics that they should have, which should include certainly their capacity to reason, to write, to communicate, to care. All of those are going to be core elements for choosing physicians, most of which are not associated with organic chemistry. And so I think that, yes, we need to have a process. You know, it's interesting. Every now and then I come across interviews with celebrities and other famous people in a whole range of fields who talk about how they wanted to be doctors, but they didn't make it. And usually they'll kind of laugh about it. And often they'll say, yeah, it was chemistry that got me. Just last week, I was listening to an interview on the X-Files, one of my favorite podcasts, with Kobe Keenan, who was President Obama's chief speechwriter. And, you know, he talked about the fact that he wanted to be a physician and he didn't make it through chemistry. And so he ended up having to find a different path. And one of the things that was interesting, and as I listened to this, is that Keenan was extremely successful because when he ended up in the White House and was faced with becoming a speechwriter, he had to absorb massive amounts of information on every possible topic that came before Congress, anything the president was going to have to talk about. He would have to, in a very short order, assimilate an enormous amount of material and really distill it and then use that to craft the president's words. And so I'm thinking to myself, really? So organic chemistry was used to make a determination that this guy didn't have what it take to be a physician? And I've heard this quite often.
It's really fascinating because one of the things about that anecdote, of course, is that some of the key skills I've just named, discipline, ability to absorb information, to apply yourself, to pay close attention, to repeat it back, he apparently was very, very good at that. And the article I quoted earlier by Pamela Gwynn Kripke, the journalist, oddly enough, tucked into the article, she provided her own story of superb skill at diagnostics by her, not her doctors. She tosses it in on the side, but she mentions that one of her family members was being consequentially misdiagnosed. I think it was her daughter, with an obscure shoulder injury. 6 physicians, 4 MRIs, and 3 nerve conduction tests could not diagnose her daughter, and she figured it out, which makes you wonder if maybe she would have been a pretty good doctor if that door had been left open. Maybe we shouldn't have knocked her out of the medical field at the OChem level, which of course I'm sympathetic to your point.
I think that I'm not going to be able to prove that organic chemistry is the wrong way to screen.
I forgive you.
Yeah, so I'm not going to be able to prove that organic chemistry is not the way to screen people for medical careers. And similarly, I'm not going to be able to prove that so much of what happens once you're in medical school, which is so similar, having to memorize the 16 different types of collagen. I can't remember what the number is now. It's very hard, again, to prove a negative. And then, of course, the larger question becomes, what are we not learning instead? What skills are we not developing instead? What's being lost when we do this? One thing that has struck me recently has been the number of studies that have come out that compare how physicians perform compared to nurse practitioners. And there was actually a Cochrane review, in other words, a large systematic review of studies looking at this, and basically found that, starting with primary care physicians and comparing them to nurse practitioners, that there weren't meaningful differences in terms of how they perform on a whole range of quality measures. There's another set of studies that tries to look at how nurse practitioners compared to a range of specialists. And that's a little harder to study. There's less literature on that. But again, it was striking that there were far, far more similarities than differences. But it was actually hard to show that physicians were outperforming nurses across a wide range of specialty care. And now, I think that given that physicians spend years training, far more than nurse practitioners, and given that the selection process for getting into medical school is far more demanding than getting into nursing school, there should be a chasm of difference. If I spent these years and years and hundreds of thousands of dollars getting to where I'm at, and I'm not performing much better or necessarily better at all compared to a group of people who were not as carefully selected and have had far less training, well, then what was all that effort for? And I think that, to me, raises critical questions about, and I'm quite honestly, I think organic chemistry is a great example of that. This nurse probably didn't do the organic chemistry I did, and I made it through all that organic chemistry. The fact is that had no effect on my performance as a clinician, and that's why she didn't need it, or he didn't need it. So I think that's the point. How much of what I struggled over all that time was stuff that didn't ultimately make me better at my job? And what could I have been doing instead that would have given me an enormous competitive advantage compared to somebody who didn't do all that stuff? That's what I'm thinking about.
If we really take your question seriously, we have to be very worried about the design of medical school curricula, which is mostly fixed by the history of the Flexner Report, somewhat modeled after German medical institutions in the 19th century. If we really take your question seriously, we have to be concerned that the default approach to this from medical school admissions committees is really not necessarily a great form of wisdom. And in essence, I now realize the more we take your question seriously, the fewer firm planks I have to articulate upon, to say, this is what we need. I mean, actually, to say yes to what you just said, Saul, is to leave us with a paper-thin understanding of what it is we're trying to build. And that's very scary.
Yeah, I have a close colleague who I've worked with for many years, Alan Schwartz, who is a specialist in medical decision-making. And it's been a pet peeve of his that medical decision-making is actually not taught in medical school. And if you think about it, the one thing that all physicians who take care of patients do all day long is make medical decisions. And so, for instance, and I think we've talked about this on other podcasts, there is a whole conceptual framework for thinking about how you make a good medical decision. What types of information do you take into account? How do you integrate information about the patient's clinical state with the research evidence and patient life context and preferences? And how do you weigh those and how do you integrate them? And is that less important than some of the pathways I had to memorize in biochemistry that I've never used and that no one remembers? That's, in my opinion, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I will endorse this, meaning that day to day, there is some scientific evidence, there is some diagnostic work, there is a patient whose life may or may not fit with my recommended treatment, and they have preferences. And I have to somehow put together these four things to help figure out what's the right next thing to do for Mrs. Jones or, Mr. Akumba. And that is a remarkable skill. And what you're saying to me, I agree, it is not actually taught in medical school, which is a concern. I still have my hidden reservations about the need to have firmly disciplined people coming into medical school, and I still feel that way. But you have given me a lot of reason to be skeptical of OCHEM in particular.
I want to push back on your comment about needing disciplined, highly focused people, because I actually do think we need disciplined, highly focused people going into medicine. That's not the challenge that I'm posing. The challenge I'm posing is whether that determination should be based on how people do in this one particular area that we call organic chemistry. I think that we talk about this course as being a weed out course, a course that, quote, separates the wheat from the chaff, a trial by fire course, a culling process. All of this is the stuff that I saw in the comments. And I think we need to get past that. And not just for organic chemistry, but for the entire way in which we think about how we're training physicians once they're in medical school and beyond, and start to have a good faith conversation about what we want our physicians to know, what we want them to be able to do. Again, people talk about reverse engineering curriculum, what it is that we want to create as a path to getting there. And then, obviously, at that point, some are going to perform well and some are not. The ones who are going to perform well are going to have to be disciplined and focused. But the process of selecting them is going to be based on a set of conditions that reflect the path to achieving what we think our physicians should look like. And I surmise that that's not going to be a path that starts with organic chemistry.
I'm moved a lot by this, and I think that it's a hard thing to remember to ask. Who and what are we trying to create at the end of this process? It's a very hard thing to remember to ask, in part because it's a very hard question. And so it's just much easier to say, do we have customs that we like? We have customs that we're used to. And I think I agree with you. I'm not sure the customs that we are all used to are the ones that are creating the best possible healers for the future patients or for the patients of today. I honestly agree with you on that.
And I think there are a couple of consequences of not having this conversation and not taking it forward. The first consequence is there may be a lot of people who are not becoming physicians who would make wonderful physicians. There may be a lot of people who are getting into medical school because they can perform very well in this arcane set of activities who lack many of the qualities and characteristics that we want in our physicians. And finally, of those who do get into medical school, we may be affecting them in adverse ways. We may be changing them in ways that are unfortunate. We may be failing to cultivate in them characteristics and fostering a kind of growth that their future patients need. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's what happens when you're not thoughtful about the process of creating physicians and how the failure to do that thoughtfully causes harm, and harm that ultimately affects the people who need good care.
I think you've said that with remarkable clarity. With that, I'll say thank you very much, Saul, for pushing us to discuss this organic chemistry story, because it's not just about organic chemistry. It's about a profession, and it's about people's chance of getting better when they get sick and of preserving their health when they're not. Thanks so much for the time that you put into this with me.
Thanks, Stefan. We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have, and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Take care, everyone.